In this video, I want to talk to you about Em units and why we use them at CodyHouse for our spacing and typography systems. So Em, just like Rem units, are CSS relative units, which means that they are relative to something. And to fully understand Em units, you should compare them to Rem units. So let's start from Rem. When Rem is equal to the font size of the root HTML element. So if we check this example, on the element 2, we have a font size equal to 1 rem. And we were saying before, 1 rem is equal to the font size of the HTML element. Now, by default, all browsers apply a font size to the HTML element, and this font size is almost always equal to 16 pixels. So we can assume that 1 rem is equal to 16 pixels. For the same reason, 2 rem is equal to twice 16 pixels. And 1.5 will be 1.5 by 16 pixels, so 24 pixels. What if we switch to Em units instead? Right, first of all, 1 Em is equal to the computed font size of the element it is applied to, which means that 1 Em is not relative to the font size of the HTML element, but it's relative to the font size of the element it is applied to. So with Em, you should think this way. Let's consider the element with the class 1. If we didn't apply any font size to this element, it would inherit the font size of the HTML element, which is 16 pixels. Which means that the base font size for this element is 16 pixels. Therefore, 1em is equal to 16 pixels. 2em, for the same reason, will be twice that 16 pixels, 32, and the same goes for element 3. So if we have a flat structure, meaning a structure with no nesting, there is no difference between Em and Rem units. But to fully understand the differences between these two units, we have to nest these elements here. So we can move element 2 inside element 1, and then element 3 can be a child of element 2. Okay? Now, what about Rem units? There is no change in the font size of the elements by using Rem units. Well, that's because they are relative, remember, to the font size of the HTML element, which is always 16 pixels, which means that 1 rem is still going to be equal to 16 pixels, 2 rem is still going to be equal to 32, and so on. What about Em units? Now, as you can see, things look really different. Now, if we consider element 1, okay, if we didn't apply any font size at all, its font size will be the same of its parent, which is 16 pixels on the HTML element. So it will be 16 pixels. So when we set a font size equal to 2em, is 32 pixels. Now, what is the value of 1em on the element 2? If we didn't apply any font size on this element, its font size will be equal to 32 pixels. So the base font size for element 2 is no longer 16 pixels, it's 32 pixels, which means that 1em is equal to 32 pixels. What about element 3? If we didn't apply any font size on element 3, it would inherit the font size of element 2, which is 32 pixels, which means that for element 3, 1em is equal to 32 pixels, and 1.5 is equal to 32 pixels multiplied by 1.5, so it will be 48 pixels. So this is 48, and this one is 32. What if, for example, we change this value to 0.5em, okay? Now remember, the base font size for element 2 is 32 pixels. So 0.5 will be 0.5 by 32 pixels. So we have 16 pixels. And now, the base font size for element 3, it's 16 pixels. And 1.5 of 16 pixels is equal to 24 pixels. So I know it may sound confusing using Ems at first, but if you learn how to use Em units properly, you can speed up your workflow by a lot. But one thing that's really important to understand is that if you use M units, you should not try to keep track of the converted pixel values. Now, we're doing it in this example just because we want to fully understand the meaning of the computed value of M units. But if you are in a real project, you shouldn't do this. You can remove these comments, because if you work with M units, you should think in M units. Okay, so let's see one of the main advantages of using M units. We have a component from the CodyHouse UI framework, and it's an order summary component. Now, in this component, all of the spacing, so margin, paddings, also typography, the size of these images is set using M units. Now, say we want to control the size of all these elements at once. We can do so changing the font size of the parent component, which in this case is called order summary. So this is the class we have to target. If here we change the font size to something equal to, for example, 1.25 am, we're increasing everything. So margin, paddings, typography. So one great advantage of using M units is that you can control multiple elements at once by changing the font size of the parent. You could even use in CodyFrame a text font size utility class, like for example text MD, because you are de facto applying a font size here. And once again, you can see everything is adapting when you change the font size. Okay, and you can push this to the limits. For example, in CodyFrame, we change the body font size at a specific breakpoint. And when you do so, you can check it here. If we resize the window at a specific breakpoint, everything is already changing, even though there is no media query here. Well, that's because the body font size changes. And by changing the body font size, by changing its M value, there is a cascade effect which is affecting all of the elements of the page, spacing, typography, and so on. If you were not using M units, but for example M units, on this component you should create a media query, for example, and then change the size of the title, the size of the margin, paddings, and so on. Instead, you don't have to write anything here because you already have a macro responsive rule simply by changing the font size of the body. Now, there are also some issues when you work with M units. If we consider, for example, this list here, we have a list of items, and this label has this utility class applied, text base, which sets the font size equal to 1em, while all these other list items have a text LG utility class, which sets the font size to a value which is higher than 1em. Now, if we apply the same padding left MD, for example, to this element, if we check the result here, we can see that now they have a different padding left values, even though we are using the same utility class. Well, that's because paddings in CodyFrame at least, they're set using M values. Now, the 1em on this element, the value of 1em is different than the value of 1em on this element here, because they have different font sizes. And remember, an M is 1em is relative to the font size of the element it is applied to. So how do we fix this? Now, one way to fix this is to, for example, create a wrapper here. Let me remove this for a second. And we can do the same for this element here. And then we move the text font size utility classes inside these new wrappers we just created. And you do so because now the padding left is no longer affected by the font size, because we are applying the font size on a child. So if we duplicate this element a few times, now you can see the padding left is the same. Now, in CodyFrame, we also have another way of dealing with this. If we check this example here, we have two buttons that toggle a menu. Now, this second menu is inside this section here. Now, if we change the font size of this section to something like text XS, for example, now we know that everything is going to be affected by the new font size. Also, the menu itself. But normally, you don't want menus to look different. Even though the control, the button is smaller, you still want this element here to look the same. So in cases like this one, you can use a sass mixin that we have in CodyFrame. Actually, we have two. The first one is called space unit. You can pass it a value, which becomes the new space unit value for the spacing scale. So if you pass 1 rem, for example, you're setting a new spacing scale for this element, which is based on rem units, which means that this spacing scale is no longer affected by the em values of the parent of this element. And the same goes for the text unit mixin, which in this case is targeting the typography scale. So we are switching from a typography scale based on em units to a typography scale based on rem units. Once again, this component is no longer affected by the em values, the font size values of the parent. So if we check again the menu here, now you see they look the same. So you can use these mixins for those small components that you want to look the same regardless of the font size of their parent. So okay, that's all for this video, and thanks for watching.